Good morning to everyone. I hope you hear me.
Yes, madam.
Okay, thank you. I shall now start the lecture, and I'm sure you can concentrate for 1 hour. And I can assure you, trust me, it will not go on for more than 1 hour. Therefore, please concentrate. And if you have any questions, you can ask me at the end of the lecture. Thank you. I shall now share the screen with you. Can you see the screen? Can you see the screen? Yes or no? Can somebody?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Now, today I would be discussing with you about qualitative interviews and focus groups. You have already studied the distinctions between the qualitative approach to research and the quantitative approach to research. One such distinction is the method of data collection. There are methods of data collection inherent to the quantitative approach, which are questionnaires and structured interviews, and there are methods inherent to the qualitative approach, which are unstructured and semi-structured interviews, referred to as in-depth interviews. Focus group discussions and observations are also methods of data collection in qualitative research. I will discuss with you today the in-depth interview method and focus group discussions. When we consider an interview takes place between an interviewer who conducts the interview and the interviewee who is being interviewed. Let us now consider the differences between structured interviews used in quantitative research and qualitative interviews, which I said are unstructured or semi-structured in nature. Qualitative interviews are less structured as there is greater interest in the interviewee's point of view, whilst in quantitative interviews, the approach is structured as the interview is designed to answer a clearly specified set of questions set by the interviewer. Qualitative interviews considers the interviewee's point of view, as the emphasis is on the interviewee's perception, whilst in structured interviews, the emphasis is on the interviewer's concerns. Qualitative interviews encourage rambling off the topic as it gives insights into what the interviewee sees as relevant and important. Whereas in quantitative interviews, rambling is regarded as a nuisance and is discouraged as the researcher requires answers to specified questions. Qualitative interviews tend to be more flexible, responding to the direction in which the interviewee takes the interview, whilst in qualitative interviews, it is typically inflexible because of the need to standardize the way in which each interview is conducted. Qualitative interviews seek rich, detailed answers in order to understand the interviewee's perception. But in quantitative interviews, the researcher expects short and precise answers that can be coded and processed quickly. In qualitative interviews, the aim is to understand rather than to generalize, as there is an emphasis on each interviewee's own perspective. Qualitative interviews are useful when resolving any business organizational issue. Therefore, this technique will be important for you in the future when leading business organizations. Therefore, this is not only focusing on your particular research study, but for your future career development, having these skills will be very important. Next, we will consider the differences between unstructured and semi-structured interviews in qualitative research. Unstructured. In unstructured interviews, the researcher will use some jotted down hints to deal with a range of loosely defined topics. The interviewer will ask open-ended questions and the interviewee will respond freely at length. The unstructured interview tends to be very similar in character to a conversation. When considering semi-structured interviews, the researcher has a list of questions of fairly specific topics to be covered, which is referred to as an interview guide. However, in semi-structured interviews, the question order and phrasing are flexible. That is, questions may not be asked in the sequence outlined in the interview guide. New questions may be asked depending on the responses of the interviewee. It should be borne in mind that both in unstructured and semi-structured interviews, the interview process is flexible and it should seek the worldviews of the research participants rather than reflecting the researcher's own concerns. For example, if you're researching on buy budgets, which is a management control technique, was not a success in a manufacturing company operating in a traditional Sri Lankan village, you can carry out unstructured or semi-structured interviews. You must bear in mind that you need to tease out how the interviewee of a traditional village perceive the world and the reasons that the interviewee will come up with. Therefore, you have to be flexible in the interview questioning process. Moving on to the advantages of semi-structured interviewing. When doing multiple case study research, it will be necessary to have some structure in order to ensure cross-case comparability. Consequently, semi-structured interviews will be useful. if more than one person is to carry out the fieldwork in order to ensure comparability, again, semi-structured interviews will be important. If the research is beginning with a fairly clear focus, semi-structured interviews will be advantageous as it is more specific that to the issues to be addressed. One of my research students wanted to study how the differences in the training processes in a big four audit firm and an indigenous audit firm lead to differences in the career prospects of the audit training. In such a study, you see that a comparison is required and it will be necessary to ask similar questions from audit partners, audit managers, and audit trainees of the two different firms. This is a good example for the need of semi-structured interviews. Now, in semi-structured interviews, it is necessary to have a set of questions. So when formulating questions, for that, an interview guide is prepared. When formulating questions for an interview guide, when conducting semi-structured interviews, the interviewer should have an idea of the general research area, tease out specific research questions based on what the interviewer needs to answer in order to address his research questions. Based on the interview topics, interview questions should be formulated. Thereafter, review the interview questions. A pilot study should be conducted on the reviewed interview questions. Through the pilot study, novel issues which the interviewer didn't foresee should be identified. Based on the novel issues, the interview questions should be further revised. Finally, the interview questions should be finalized, which will comprise the interview guide. Now, this is a study that I carried out. Let us consider the research problem, how SEMA was able to secure its largest market in Sri Lanka. The research questions could be how SEMA gained recognition and acceptance in Sri Lanka, and how SEMA gained access to work in Sri Lanka. With respect to SEMA gaining recognition and acceptance in Sri Lanka, the interview topics could be what were the social segments involved in promoting SEMA in Sri Lanka and why they promoted SEMA in Sri Lanka. With respect to SEMA gaining access to work in Sri Lanka, the interview topics could be what business organizations employed SEMA professionals and what work do these SEMA professionals perform. You will have to decide whom to interview and the interview questions relevant to each interviewee. For example, the relevant SEMA professionals, SEMA divisional employees, tuition providers, employers will have to be interviewed. And as said before, the interview questions can be further refined through a pilot study. Preparing an interview guide, you should attempt to get an idea of what the interviewers see as significant and important in relation to research questions. Therefore, the interviewer should have a logical but a flexible order of topics so that the questions flow smoothly. Use a language that could be understood and relevant to the people who are being interviewed. Avoid leading questions. It is important not to lead interviewees. The discussion should come naturally from the interviewee. Face sheet information should be recorded. For example, name, age, gender, position in the company, number of years employed, etc. Face sheet information is important to understand in what context people provide answers. For example, the answers you obtain from a manager will differ from those of an operational employee. Preparing for the interview. How should the researcher prepare for an interview? When preparing for the interview, make yourself familiar with the setting in which the interviewee works or lives. That will help you to understand what he or she is saying in his own terms. Get a good quality tape recorder and microphone. Qualitative researchers often record and then transcribe. That is, type their interviews. That is what you call as transcribing. A good microphone is necessary because many interviewers are let down by poor recording. You should also make sure you're familiar with the operation of the equipment before the beginning of the interview. Try to arrange a quiet and private setting for the interview, or it may affect the quality of the recording, and it should be a private place so that the interviewee doesn't have to worry about being overheard. However, based on my experience, it is not always possible to tape record an interview, in spite of explaining the purpose of the interview. In such instances, you will have to make notes. Stays away. Therefore, you should type the interview as soon as possible, especially before you go to sleep in the night. If there are several interviews conducted on the same day, and if the interviews are not tape recorded, after one interview finishes, the interviewer should type the notes taken and then proceed to the next interview. Quell 1996. Quell's criteria of successful interviewer. Knowledgeable, familiar with the focus of the interview. Structuring, gives purpose for interview, rounds it off. Clear, ask simple, easy, short questions, no jargon. Gentle, lets people finish, gives them to think. Sensitive, listens to what is said and how it is said. Open, responds to what is important to interviewee. Steering, knows what he or she wants to find out. Critical, is prepared to challenge what is said. Remembering, relates what is said to what has previously been said. Interpreting, clarifies and extends meaning. Quell's 1996, kinds of questions that can be asked in qualitative interviews. The questions are highly variable. However, the kinds of questions that you could ask would be based on Quell. Introducing, can you tell me about? Follow-up, what do you mean by? Probing, could you say something about? Specifying, what happened next? Direct, what do you think about? Indirect, what do most people think about? Structuring, let's move on to. Silence, allow pauses to give the interviewee the opportunity to reflect. Interpreting, do you mean that? Interviews have to be conducted until the point of saturation where further new insights will not be obtained. As you see on the slide, the information relevant to the interviews conducted, serial number, date, interviewee, duration, should be presented in your method section in tabular form when writing the research report or when writing a research paper. And also as an annexure, questions raised from the different categories of interviewees should be provided. What the interviewee stated during the interviews can be given as direct quotes when narrating the case study. Audio recording and transcribing. In qualitative research, the interview is usually audio recorded and transcribed. I told you transcribing is typing what is recorded. Qualitative researchers are interested in not just in what people say, but also in the way that they say it. When considering the advantages of audio recording and transcribing, the researcher is not distracted in taking down notes. The researcher can focus on listening and interpreting, corrects the natural limitations of the memory, and the intuitive glosses, that is, imaginations on what people say at interviews, that will be corrected. And there will be detailed and accurate record of interviewees' account. It opens up the data to public scrutiny by other researchers who can evaluate the analysis of the original researcher, which is known as secondary analysis. The transcribing procedure is very time consuming, and it also requires good equipment in the form of a good quality recording device and microphone. In Sri Lanka, a tape recorder is commonly used. Now, we were speaking about qualitative interviews. This qualitative interviews is very important in feminist research. What do you consider as feminist approaches to interviewing? What do you mean by feminist? It is a set of ideologies which advocate political, social, economic, and intellectual equality for men and women. In other words, avoid sex discrimination. What is feminist research? Feminist research focuses on knowledge about women's lives, the experiences of women in natural social settings, where the aim is to make women visible, raise their consciousness, and empower them and transformation of society. What is feminist approach to research? Methodologically, feminist research differs from traditional research in that it actively seeks to remove the power imbalance between the researcher and participant. It seeks to change social inequality, and it begins with the standpoint and experiences of women. Let's consider an example of feminist research. An example of feminist research would be the sad story of prostitutes. They speak about their world, what they are engaged in, why they are engaged in prostitution, how they are being abused by men. These situational realities cannot be understood unless you use the qualitative approach to research and the interview method of data collection. Next, we will move on to the advantages of participant observation over qualitative interviewing. Now, at the beginning of the lecture, I told you that in qualitative research, the methods of data collection are qualitative interviewing, observations, and focus group discussion. And now I'm comparing observations and qualitative interviews. Observations and qualitative interviews, advantages of participant observations over qualitative interviews. You will discuss at your next lecture that observations can be covered or overt. Now, when all these things will be elaborated in your next lecture, but we are speaking here about overt observation, where people see that you're being observed, participant observation. The advantages of participant observation over qualitative interviewing are the ability to see through others' eyes. The researcher's prolonged immersion in a social setting in participant observation would make him or her better equipped to see through others' eyes, being familiarized with the culture and context. And also the native language of the people who are being observed will be learned. This will again help you to observe them very well. Taken for granted ideas are more likely to be revealed. The interviewer relies mainly on verbal behavior, and matters that interviewee takes for granted are less likely to be revealed, whereas in participant observation, implicit features in social life are more likely to be revealed by the observer's continued presence. And because of the ability to observe the behavior rather than just rely on what is said. Access to deviant or hidden activities. Participant observation makes it easy to access deviant, in the sense things which people don't want to do in public because it is unethical, like drug addiction or hidden activities. There are areas that those are involved in deviant activities are reluctant to talk about in an interview context alone. Understanding and trust are likely to come through prolonged interaction in participant observation. Participant observers' sensitivity to the context. The participant observer's extensive contact with a social setting allows the context of the people's behavior to be understood. Why do the people behave in this way could be understood. Flexibility in encountering the unexpected. Because of the unstructured nature of participant observation, it is more likely to discover unexpected topics or issues. Also, participant observation is more flexible, whereas in the interview, there is a tendency for interviewers to incorporate an element of comparability when questioning different interviewees. Naturalistic emphasis. Participant observation has the potential to come closer to a naturalistic emphasis because the qualitative researcher confronts members of a social setting in their natural environment, whereas in interviewing, it is not the case. However, each method of data collection will have its own strengths and weaknesses. Therefore, now I am going to highlight to you, elaborate to you, advantages of qualitative interviewing over participant observation. Qualitative interviewing is what I discussed with you all this time. Qualitative interview makes it possible to find out about issues relevant to observation. There is a wide range of issues that cannot be observed. For example, domestic violence, sex abuse, so that asking people about them is the only possible way to find out. During qualitative interviews, interviews reflect on past events. Qualitative researchers often ask interviews to think about what happened in the past, and certain series of events are unfolded in relation to a current issue. This reconstruction of events cannot be accomplished through participant observation. Qualitative interviews is more ethically defensible. There are certain areas that could be observed indirectly through hidden hardware like microphones, but this is not ethical. In such situations, the researcher would have to rely on interview accounts. Qualitative interviews has a fewer reactive effect. The presence of a participant observer would result in reactive effects of the people observed. People's knowledge of the fact that they are being observed may make them behave less naturally. Qualitative interviewing is less intrusive in people's lives. Participant observer can be very intrusive, that is, disturbing in people's lives, that the observer can take up a lot of time of the interviewee. Qualitative interviewing is more feasible for longitudinal research. That is, what happened now in 1 year's time, in 5 years' time, over some years of time, the research study is carried out and data is collected. Interviewing can be carried out within a longitudinal research design somewhat more easily because repeat interviews may be easier to organize than repeat visits to the natural setting to carry out participant observation. Qualitative interviews allow greater breadth of coverage. Interviewing can allow access to wider variety of people and situations than participant observation. Qualitative interviewing has specific focus. Qualitative research sometimes begin with a specific focus, and qualitative interviewing would be better suited to such situations since the interview can be directed at that focus. Now, because each method of data collection has its own advantages and disadvantages, in other words, strengths and weaknesses, you can go into method triangulation, that is, using more than one method of data collection. In a research study which I carried out, how and why SEMA was able to secure its largest market in Sri Lanka, I used the interview technique as well as the participant observation technique. There is a hegemonic culture that the SEMA professionals are assimilated to, which is visible at the events organized by SEMA in Sri Lanka. At one of these events, as a participant observer, I observed a long-standing SEMA professional saying to the SEMA international director who came from London to attend the function, "Oh, thank you very much, Kathy. Had a lovely evening." However, before this observation was made, this long-standing SEMA professional was interviewed at his office, and he was of the firm belief that SEMA was exploitative, which made me understand that the statement made to Kathy was a fake statement by him. What I want to say is that it is useful to use more than one method of data collection. Now, you can use qualitative interviewing, observations, which will be discussed in your next lecture in detail, and also another method of data collection in qualitative research is focus groups. Therefore, now I will discuss with you about focus group. Method of data collection in qualitative research, another method, focus group. I will now open that slideshow. Do you see the screen? Do you see the screen? Can somebody answer, please? Do you see the screen?
Yes, madam.
Thank you very much. What is a focus group? It is a form of group interview in which there are several participants in addition to a moderator, who is also called facilitator. The interviewees all belong to a particular social context. That is, they are known to have been involved in a particular situation. In a focus group, there is an emphasis in the questioning on a particular well-defined topic. The emphasis is upon interaction within the group members and the joint construction of discussion, where I conducted interviews with accounting professionals on the separations between the observer and the accounting profession within the Sri Lankan context. All who interviewed were invited for a focus group discussion. During the interviews, diverse views were obtained. However, the participants came to a consensus at the focus group discussion. Users of focus groups. Let us consider the users of focus groups. Focus groups are used to examine the way people collectively organize knowledge. That is, the focus group has to become a popular method for researchers, examining the ways in which people jointly interpret the general topics in which the researcher is interested. Focus group help to understand why people hold certain views. The focus group technique allows the researcher to develop an understanding about why do people feel the way they do. The focus group approach offers the opportunity of allowing people to probe into each other's reasons for holding a certain view. Focus groups help to elicit a wide range of views in relation to a particular issue. Focus groups are useful in feminist research. It is appealing to the feminist researchers as it is compatible in accordance with the ethics and politics of feminism. I spoke to you today when discussing about the interviews what feminist research is. Feminist research focuses on the experiences of women in natural settings. For example, prostitutes can be interviewed individually, and a collective discussion by means of a focus group discussion can be carried out to elicit why they have been prostitutes. Another example is women employees in banks can be invited to engage in a discussion as to why there are more opportunities for the males to be promoted to managerial positions in banks rather than for the females. In other words, why there is sex discrimination relevant to promotion. Wilkinson gives reasons for considering the focus group as a feminist method which seeks to remove the power imbalance between the researcher and subject. Focus groups are less artificial than other methods because it mirrors normal interaction in social life with the emphasis on everyday life experiences. Focus groups avoid deconceptualization of individuals because he or she is a part of a group and the participants all belong to a particular social context and are involved in a particular situation. Focus groups are less exploitative. The participants have the liberty to express their views, and the moderator, that is the facilitator, does not play a dominant role. Recording and transcribing in focus groups. In focus group discussions, it is better to tape record rather than take notes. Due to the difficulty in writing down exactly what people say and also what people say and also who says the recorded hold on while you write something down. But in a focus group discussion, it would be disturbing. Recording allows the record of how the topic was discussed. A major reason for conducting focus group research is that it is possible to study the processes whereby meaning is collectively constructed in each session. In a focus group discussion, it can be difficult to distinguish voices. Hence, it is extremely important to ensure that you equip yourself with a high quality microphone to pick up voices that are faint and also voices that come from different directions. There was a focus group discussion for employees of business organizations to find out how the accounting degree curriculum of the University of Sri Javadrapura could be designed to produce employable graduates. The recording and transcribing had to be carried out by me, whilst in questions raised by the moderator helped to understand the flow of the discussion. I requested each employer to mention his or her name and the business organization before he or she spoke in order to distinguish who said what. How many focus groups? It should be more than one, but not too many. Clearly, It is unlikely just one group will suffice to satisfy the needs of the researcher, since there is a possibility that the responses are particular to that group. However, too many groups will be a waste of time and resources. When the moderator reaches the point that he or she is able to anticipate what the next group is going to say, then there are enough groups. The number of groups should continue until the theoretical saturation point is reached. That is, still no new insights are obtained. Socio-demographic characteristics. When focus groups are formed, stratifying criteria, in other words, segmented criteria, could be used, such as age, gender, social class, etc. A large number of groups is preferred in order to capture a diverse range of viewpoints. For example, what did the rich have to say? And what did the poor have to say? What did the younger generation have to say? And what did the older generation have to say about how the Sri Lankan economy can recover from the downturn caused by the COVID pandemic? However, it should be noted that running more groups increases volume of data and complexity of analysis. Should the focus group be small in number or large in number? According to Morgan 1998, smaller size groups are used when topics are controversial or complex, when participants have a lot to say on a research issue, and when collecting participants' personal detailed accounts. Larger groups are useful when involvement with a topic by the participants are likely to be low, and when the researcher wants to hear numerous brief suggestions. Irrespective of it being a small group or being a large group, over recruitment is necessary, as there could be no shows. That is, there could be people promising to come but not turning up. Level of moderator involvement, the facilitator's involvement when conducting the focus group discussion. So the facilitator trying not to be involved in an unwelcome way. The word used for this is unobtrusive and non-directive, that is not giving instructions. In qualitative research, the aim is to get at the perspectives of the participants. Consequently, the approach of the moderator should not be interfering and control. Ask a small number of general questions to stimulate discussion. There is a tendency for researchers to use a fairly small number of general questions to guide the focus group sessions. Give the freedom to the participants. The advantage of giving freedom to the participants to engage in the discussion is that the researcher stands a better chance of finding out what the participants see as important and interesting. Intervene if the discussion wanders off, that is, going off the track, or if there is a long time of silence. Too much of irrelevant discussion will be unproductive, and spells of long silence will be a waste of time. Respond to potentially interesting points that are not picked up by the participant. One way in which the moderator may need to be involved is in responding to specific points that are of interest for the research questions, but that were not picked up by the participants. The discipline within the forum is maintained by the moderator. If the participants begin to talk at the same time, which will make the audio recording unclear, the moderator should remind the participants to talk one at a time. Also, some participants have the tendency to monopolize the discussion, and some participants are slow in expressing their views. The moderator should encourage these participants to speak. Selecting participants. Participants are usually selected on a basis of a shared experience or characteristic. That is, Anyone for whom the topic is relevant can logically be an appropriate participant. Participants should be selected based on socio-demographic factors, that is, stratifying criteria, in other words, segmenting criteria. A wide range of people will be required but they are organized into separate groups in terms of stratifying criteria such as age, gender, education, occupation, and having or not having had a certain experience. So there so many focus group discussions can be carried out. Participants for each group can then be selected either randomly or through some kind of snowball sampling method. What is snowball sampling? Snowball sampling is a recruitment technique where research participants are asked by the researcher to identify potential participants. For example, the researcher can say, "Do you know of anyone else who could be invited for the discussion?" And that person too can be invited for the discussion by the researcher. In selecting participants, should it be strangers or natural groups? Should you select people who are unknown to each other, that is strangers, or select people who are known to each other, that is natural groups? Each method of selection has its own merits or demerits. If there are natural groups, taken for granted assumptions by the group cannot be elicited. That is, participants will not speak about what is known by all. Oh, that person also knows, the other person also knows. Why should I say speak about this? That would be the assumption. Sometimes when you are among strangers, the participants may have a fear to speak. Therefore, you have to decide how you are going to, what is the size and how you're going to organize it and things like that. You have to make a decision before before organizing the focus group. Asking questions. When asking questions at a focus group discussion, should a few questions, that is, few general questions be asked to provoke a response, or should a set of structured questions covering specific topics be asked? General questions or structured questions? There is probably no one best way of style of questioning and moderating. But there are factors which depends. For example, the nature of the research topic. If it is a topic that the researcher already knows about, then a structured approach is feasible. Level of interest, knowledgeable participants are there. Then a low level of participant interest may allow a more structured approach. The sensitivity of the topic. In the case of sensitive topic, several open-ended questions will be needed to stimulate the participants, and it will allow a diversity of views to be heard. Whichever strategy of questioning is employed, the moderator should allow some discussion that departs from the guide prepared, which would provide new and unexpected insights, which means there should be flexibility. Beginning and finishing the focus group discussion. Beginning and finishing, introduction and closing remarks. Introduction. It is recommended that focus group sessions begin with an introduction where the moderators thank people for coming. The participants should introduce themselves. The goals of the research should be briefly outlined, and reasons for recording the session are given, and the format of the focus group session is sketched out by the moderator. It is also important for the moderator to discuss a few ethical issues, such as only one person should speak at a time, that all data will be confidential, and that everyone's views are important, and also that amount of time that will be taken up. Some demographic information should also be collected. The focus group researchers would ask the participants to fill in forms providing basic socio-demographic information about themselves, such as age, gender, occupation, address. The participants should be told to write their first names on a card which would be placed in front of them so that the moderator could address them by name during the session. Closing remarks. At the end of the session, the moderator should thank the participants and explain briefly what will happen to the idea, to all the ideas, the data that have been supplied. Steps should be taken to coordinate a new session if required. Now let us consider an example. The COVID-19 pandemic has created turbulence in the business environment, which has brought disruption in businesses. The impact created by the pandemic on small business organizations are different from that of large business organizations. The pandemic situation demands changes in the business practices and work practices. Consequently, the professionals are required to respond to the emerging changes. However, there have been business organizations within the Sri Lankan context which seized opportunities and became profitable ventures. Some business organizations have been able to break even and sustain business without going into bankruptcy. How resilience was maintained in each business organization during the pandemic could be found out by a researcher by conducting focus group discussions for those who are employed in each business organization. A single focus group discussion can be conducted for a particular business organization, or separate focus group discussions can be carried out for a particular business organization using segmenting criteria, stratifying criteria, for example, one for the employees, one for the business leaders, etc. A moderator should begin the focus group discussion, and the focus group discussion will be carried out. When the process is happening, there will be interactions where the discussion will be directed towards how resilience was maintained during the pandemic. Now let us move on to the interactions that will take place during the focus group discussion. Kitzinger, 1994, has found two forms of interactions in focus group: complementary interactions and argumentative interactions. In complementary interactions, each participant builds on the previous remarks, agreement between viewpoints will emerge, and finally there will be a consensus. On the contrary, in argumentative interactions, participants challenge each other, make participants account for their views, and finally, the opinions are revised and modified. Through the interactions in the focus group discussions, as based on the example that I narrated to you, why there was resilience, in the sense, reasons for the success story of the business organization during the pandemic could be elicited. Limitations of focus groups. Now, I said that there are various methods of data collection in qualitative research. Triangulation is the answer. Now, I'm going to I highlighted to you about limitations of observations, limitations of qualitative interviews. Now, limitations of focus groups. Limitations of focus groups are researcher has less control over proceedings. There is a very delicate balance of power between the participants and the moderator. Data is difficult to analyze, as a huge amount of data is very quickly produced, and developing a strategy of analysis that incorporates both themes in what people say and patterns of interaction is not easy. Difficult to organize, as there is risk of no-shows. It is common for people to give their consent to participate and not turn up. Therefore, it is a common practice to over-recruit on the grounds that at least one or two people will not turn up. Very time-consuming to transcribe. The recording of focus group sessions are more time consuming to transcribe than recording of individual interviews because of variations in voice pitch and the need to take accounts of who says what. Tendency towards more agreement than disagreement in discussion. Often there is consensus rather than being argumentative in focus group discussions. It is good if there are several arguments during the focus group discussion and finally a consensus is arrived to. Potential for causing participant discomfort, as discomfort can be caused when intimate details of private lives need to be revealed. Finally, how to overcome the limitations of focus groups. As I have told you over and over again, you can overcome the limitations of each method of data collection in qualitative research by means of triangulation. So as I said, you can collect data from qualitative interviews, triangulate that data with the observational data the data you collected from observations, and also you can have a focus group discussion with inviting the people whom you have been interviewing to discuss the various views that they have been providing and discussing and to come into a consensus. So method triangulation is an answer for the limitations of each method of data collection relevant to qualitative research. Okay, thank you very much.